Okay, so the Minister's Black Veil. Now, real quickly in terms of the plot here, I know we focused on this with the other ones, right? It is parallel. Um, the discourse time to story time. Again, we have a long summary, but this time, rather than being right at the very end, the summary is closer to the middle. Right on 691, at the bottom of the page, we're told, from that time, no attempts were made to remove Mr. Hooper's black veil. Okay, well, great. uh, so what we know is at this point then there's a long summary, um, and it leads up to the point of his death, where we pick back up and we get to watch him die. So rather than being right at the very end, it summarizes a large chunk of his life, leading up to the end. So it's similar, but located a little bit differently. Otherwise, again, pretty straightforward plot. What we're particularly interested in here, I think, is the symbolism of this black veil, and trying to understand why it is that he wears the black veil, which, very interestingly, is exactly what the other characters within the story are trying to understand, and exactly what our narrator never tells us. Isn't that fascinating? It was a wonderful piece of writing, that Hawthorne is able to keep from us, the answer to our question, even though we get to see our question explored by various characters throughout the story. I mean, it's really, really wonderful. And it works fantastically well. We're told here at the beginning, the minister's black veil, a parable. And so by definition, there's going to be some ambiguity to it. We know that it is a highly symbolic story, and we know that it is an allegorical story, and we know that it is only through the sort of reflecting on and meditating on the application of the story to ourselves that we come to an answer. That's how a parable works. The answer can't be given, right? So at some point, of course, we're supposed to relate ourselves to the minister, right? And so this is the Reverend Mr. Hooper. You'll see throughout here this language that we've looked at before, gloom and so forth, although it's interesting to note, the town itself is not gloomy. The people themselves don't seem to be gloomy. We don't get the kind of, Endicott type representation of Puritans here that we've gotten before. These are people who, they come to church, they like to schmooze the minister, they want him to come over and have brunch. He has a fiance. He's popular. He's called to go. They exchange pulpits with other ministers, which was a common puritanical thing. You would have a sort of set of sermons that they would preach, and then they would exchange to hear other sermons and so forth. It just doesn't seem like a bad place. It's a nice, functioning, sort of friendly town. Until this one freaking thing happens. The effect is so amazing, right? He simply puts on a black veil. And what we're told by Hawthorne is that it's a gloomy shade before him. So the gloom that comes in the other stories is something that Hooper attaches to himself so that he becomes the gloom, right? He lives ever in it. But the interesting effect that we get to see is that when he looks at other people, he sees them veiled, right? This is something he talks about near the end, and we'll look at this. But the question that everyone has from the beginning is, why has he done this? They speculate different things. Maybe he's done it for some sort of dramatic effect, and they expect that he'll, it's like an object lesson. He'll take it off, and then he'll preach a sermon about it, and they'll understand. Another possibility, though, they say, is that they question on 687, did he seek to hide his face from the dread being whom he was addressing? So is he hiding from God? The reason he would do that is because of sin, right? And so eventually there is a conversation between the physician and his wife, right? This is Saunders on 688, where the physician, Mr. Saunders, says to his wife, something has to be wrong with his intellect. In other words, he's either going crazy or there's some kind of psychological illness. He says, but the strangest part is the effect it has on even sober-minded man like myself. That is, regardless of why Hooper is doing it, the effect it has on everybody else is truly remarkable. He says it's thrown its influence over his whole person. And the wife says, I wonder if he's not afraid to be alone with himself. And the husband says, men sometimes are so. So there is a question then. Is he hiding himself from God, or is he hiding himself from himself? So now we have multiple theories about why he's hiding. We have this interesting description of a funeral on 688. Veils are often associated with funerals and death, of course. He delivers the prayer before they proceed with the body. And we're told it was, a prayer of sorrow imbued with celestial hope. People could almost hear the harp, right? But the people trembled when he prayed because they darkly understood him, and himself and all of the mortal race might be ready as he trusted this young maiden had been for the dreadful hour that should snatch the veil from their faces. So he here in this prayer during the funeral service references the veils, that at death, the veil that we all wear will be snatched away. So he's speaking metaphorically here. So now we have another explanation that the veil itself is a physical symbol of the veil that we all wear. And then they go out on the procession through the town for people to mourn. And Hooper is in the back. And we get this interesting exchange. It reminds us a lot of young Goodman Brown. Why do you look back? Said one in the procession to his partner. And the answer is interesting. I had a fancy. Now, fancy is interesting because it's closely related to it's like saying I imagined. there's an uncertainty to it, right? That is important to the Gothic. I had a fancy that the minister and the maiden's spirit were walking hand in hand. And so had I at the same moment, said the other. So what does that mean? It's as though he's made himself incorporeal, that he's made himself a figure of death through the placing of the physical veil, even though the veil itself, he says, is something that's removed at death. So the veil becomes almost this kind of portal or a threshold between dark and light, between living and dead. Well, so they resolve to find out. What the problem is, but they fail. Because they're all too scared to ask him, except for the young woman to whom he is engaged. Elizabeth, right? And so we're told, as on 690, as his plighted wife, she felt it should be her privilege to know what the black veil concealed. So she just asks him. She says, lay aside your black veil and tell me why you put it on. And his response to her is very similar to the prayer. There is an hour to come, he said, when all of us shall cast aside our veils. Take it not amiss, beloved friend, I wear this piece of crape till then. She said, well, your words are a mystery. I don't understand. Take the veil at least away from your words. So she's recognizing that the veil is a symbol, but she says, you don't have to talk to me in symbolic words. Stop veiling your words, even if you're veiling your face. He said, know then, this veil is a type and a symbol, and I am bound to wear it ever, both in light and darkness, in solitude and before the gaze of multitudes, and as with strangers, so with my familiar friends. No mortal eye will see it withdrawn. This dismal shade must separate me from the world. Even you, Elizabeth, can never come behind it. So he kind of answers it by affirming for her that it is a symbol, but she still doesn't understand why he wears it. What grievous affliction has befallen you, she earnestly inquired, that you should thus darken your eyes forever? His response is interesting because he answers it with sort of hypotheticals. He doesn't directly answer it. He says, if it be a sign of mourning, I have sorrows dark enough to be typified by a black veil. So it's possible that the veil typifies or signifies mourning. Veils are often worn this way by widows, right, or others at death or in the wake of death. But the way he answers it makes you think that's not it. And she's keen on that, right? So she says, well, I don't think people are going to buy that. She says, there may be whispers that you hide your face under the consciousness of secret sin. The implication here is that the sin is, premarital sex with her, possibly, or even with another woman, but something that would bring shame for both of them. His response is similar. He says, if I hide my face for sorrow, there is cause enough. And if I cover it for sin, who wouldn't do the same? In other words, if people want to say it's a symbol of sorrow, fine. Shouldn't we all? If people want to say it's for secret sin, fine. Shouldn't we all wear such a symbol? And in his refusal to answer her, she finally feels the terror of the veil. She covers her eyes with her hands, turns to leave the room. And he has a moment of humanity here, right? Where he's, don't leave me. Do not desert me. Be mine, and hereafter there shall be no veil over my face, no darkness between our souls. It is but a mortal veil. It is not for eternity. I'm lonely and frightened to be alone behind my black veil. She says, lift it once and look me in the face. And he says, no, I can't. And she says, fine, then farewell. Right? He has separated himself entirely from humanity, and we never know why. We get our summary moment here. And when we rejoin on 693, we're told several persons were visible by the shaded candlelight in the death chamber of the old clergyman. Everyone, basically, that he knew had died. He had outlived all of his parishioners. But Elizabeth is there. He's very old, very sick. He comes in and out of lucidness. The minister approaches his bedside. This is a young minister. And he says, Venerable Father Hooper, the moment of your release is at hand. Are you ready for the lifting of the veil that shuts in time from eternity? Yea, he says. And the Reverend Clark says, then it's fitting, right, that a man so given to prayer, blameless example, holy in deed and thought, should leave no shadow on his memory. I pray you, suffer us to be gladdened by your triumphant aspect as you go to your reward. The belief was that when people were going to heaven, when they died, they'd be joyful, and that if someone was in agony or anguish or distraught at death, it was an indication that their soul was being basically ripped to hell. So people liked to look on the sort of peaceful repose of someone who died in their piety, right? You can imagine how that would be. He reaches forward to grab the veil, and it's one of the most interesting, I think, passages. He's completely under the bedclothes. He's got the veil on. I mean, he's basically shrouded for death. He throws his hands up over the veil and screams, never on earth, never. And the minister's so afraid, he goes, dark old man. Right? With what horrible crime upon your soul are you now passing to the judgment? It's the same exact thing we want to yell out. What have you done? And what's his answer? We get beautiful imagery here, right? Heaving breath, rattling in his throat, the death rattle. He reaches his hand forward, raises himself slightly up in bed. Why do you tremble at me alone? Tremble also at each other. Have men avoided me, and women shown no pity, and children screamed and fled only for my black veil? What but the mystery which it obscurely typifies has made this piece of crepe so awful? When the friend shows his inmost heart to his friend, the lover to his best beloved. When man does not vainly shrink from the eye of his Creator, loathsomely treasuring up the secret of his sin, then deem me a monster for the symbol beneath which I have lived and die. I look around me, and lo, on every visage a black veil. It's so wonderful because he turns the whole thing, and you can immediately think how when you wear a veil, looking through it, the veil is on everything. And what we learn at the end is he wore it not to obscure himself, but to obscure them. That it is a reminder to him of the sinfulness of each of the people he looks at, not intended to be a reminder to them of his sinfulness. It's deep. But how do we take this? What are we supposed to understand from this? Well, I think the mystery requires the final paragraph. Still veiled, they laid him in his coffin, and a veiled corpse they bore him to the grave. The grass of many years has sprung up and withered on that grave. The burial stone is moss grown, and good Mr. Hooper's face is dust. But awful is still the thought that it moldered beneath the black veil. Now, I am not going to tell you how to interpret this. I think the idea behind it, because we're told it is a parable, is that it is for the individual's interpretation. However, I do think it is important to recognize, right, that he claims, at least, that the veil was not intended to signify to other people his own sin, but that he wore it to remind himself always of the sins of the people he looked at. Now, what does that mean? Is that a commentary that he is a terrible person who is supposed to be loving and forgiving others in the name of Christ as their minister, but chooses instead to focus on their sin and their wrong and their wickedness? And he wears a reminder daily so that he doesn't forget? Maybe. We know how Hawthorne feels about Puritans. Maybe that's it. The hypocrisy of Puritan faith. Or does he wear the veil to remind himself of their sin so that he doesn't forget? Doesn't forget his duty to them as minister, doesn't forget to minister to them, doesn't forget to tell them the truth, doesn't forget to pray for them. And of course, then the big question in reading the story is, allegorically, right? Do we wear veils? And when we wear veils, why do we wear them? Do we wear them to hide ourselves behind them? Or do we wear them as a way of obscuring those around us. It's very interesting to think about. So it's a deep story, right? It's intensely gothic because you have this deep interiority. We don't have a forest, we don't have a castle or a chapel or anything like that. What we have is simply the mind. That um, is a different kind of gothic landscape, a different kind of gothic setting, one that Poe is going to make tremendously good use of. Uh, but the psychology of the Gothic in this story, right? And the depth of the symbolism. And I think what's so important about a story like this, when I talk to students about it, it drives them crazy, right? What does it mean? And I don't know. And uh, and I don't think you're supposed to. I think there are supposed to be possibilities. And in a great piece of literature, a lot of times, there are possibilities. There is no definitive meaning. And I think The Minister's Black Veil is a great story for that, for you to grapple with and start to understand that sometimes that's how a great piece of literature works, a great piece of art. In the meditating on it and the reflecting on it, you find lessons, and that lesson may change as you read it again and again, as you revisit it at different points in your life. It makes it a really phenomenal story in that regard. And so I want to encourage you, not to feel like you've missed it somehow. I'm not getting it somehow. And please don't email me to ask me what it means. There are wrong interpretations, of course. If you tried to tell me this story was about evolution and dinosaurs or something like that, I would say, no, that's not what it is. But in terms of right answers, there are multiple possibilities, and I think we've covered several of them in this lecture. And so I hope you really enjoyed the sort of hauntingness of it.